For 11 months, American patrols in the Woodsman forest reported the same phenomenon. Soldiers vanished without a trace, supply lines were severed in absolute silence, and sentries disappeared from their posts as if swallowed by the trees themselves. No gunfire, no struggle, no bodies. Between September 1944 and August 1945, 17 men were lost to what G2 intelligence labeled the Ghost Hunter, an enemy so precise, so invisible, that even hardened veterans refused night duty in Sector 7. The 28th Infantry Division documented each disappearance with clinical detachment, but beneath the bureaucratic language, fear accumulated like frost on steel. Families received telegrams that offered no closure. Missing in action, circumstances unknown. The forest, dense and indifferent, kept its secrets buried beneath pine needles and fog. The phenomenon began in early autumn, when Corporal James Milliken failed to return from a routine perimeter check. His rifle was found propped against a tree, ammunition intact, no signs of combat. 3 days later, Private Howard Lenz vanished while fetching water from a stream 200 meters from camp. His canteen lay on the moss, still empty. By October, the pattern was undeniable. Men disappeared during solo tasks, always at dusk or dawn, always in wooded terrain where sightlines collapsed into shadow. The division's after-action reports grew increasingly tense, the language shifting from matter-of-fact to quietly desperate. Recommend buy, avoid single-man operations in forested sectors until threat is neutralized. But how do you neutralize what you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot predict? Command brought in specialists. A sniper team from the 82nd Airborne spent 2 weeks in overwatch positions, scanning tree lines through scopes, waiting for movement. They saw nothing. A tracking unit followed boot prints into the undergrowth, only to lose the trail where the earth turned to stone and moss. The forest seemed designed to erase evidence, to swallow sound and scent and memory. Soldiers began to whisper theories in their foxholes. A rogue SS unit, a lone fanatic with intimate knowledge of the terrain, or something older, something that had lived in these woods long before armies came. The rational mind rejects such thoughts, but exhaustion and fear erode rationality. Men who had stormed Omaha Beach admitted they were afraid of the trees. The Ghost Hunter became a legend within the division, a name spoken with the same mix of dread and fascination reserved for unexplained phenomena. Intelligence officers combed through German documents captured in nearby towns, searching for references to partisan activity or special operations units. They found nothing. The local population, when questioned, offered only silence or confusion. The Woodsman had been a hunting ground for generations, they said, but no one lived deep in the forest anymore. The war had driven everyone to the valleys, yet someone, or something, was out there, moving through the trees with the confidence of a predator on familiar ground. By December, morale in Sector 7 had deteriorated to the point of crisis. Soldiers fabricated excuses to avoid patrol duty. Officers struggled to maintain discipline without appearing to validate the fear. The division chaplain wrote in his diary, "The men are not cowards. They have proven their courage in battle. But there is something uniquely corrosive about an enemy you cannot face, cannot fight, cannot even confirm exists. It is the uncertainty that destroys them." Headquarters issued orders to intensify patrols, to flood the sector with manpower, to demonstrate that the U.S. Army would not be intimidated by shadows. But the disappearances continued. The Ghost Hunter did not escalate, did not provoke. Simply persisted, methodical and patient, as if conducting an experiment in fear. In late winter, after the bulge had been contained and the front line shifted east, the disappearances slowed but did not stop. 2 more men vanished in February, 1 in March. By then, the 28th Division had moved on, replaced by garrison units tasked with occupation duties. The new arrivals heard the stories but dismissed them as combat fatigue, the hallucinations of men who had fought too long in hell. Yet the forest remained, dark and vast, and the men assigned to patrol it felt the weight of something watching. The ghost hunter had become part of the landscape, indistinguishable from the wind and the cold and the ancient silence of trees. And then, in April 1945, as Germany collapsed and the war in Europe entered its final days, a German woodsman named Ernst Vogel walked out of the Hürtgen forest and surrendered to an American checkpoint. He was 63 years old, unarmed, and carried nothing but a worn hunting knife and a leather satchel. He asked in broken English to speak with an officer. He said he had information about the missing soldiers. The lieutenant who received him thought it was a waste of time, another desperate civilian trying to trade rumors for rations. But protocol demanded the interview be conducted. Ernst Vogel was escorted to a holding tent, given water, and told to wait. No one expected what he would say next. No one could have imagined that the ghost hunter, the phantom that had haunted an entire division, was simply an old man who knew the forest better than the soldiers who had tried to conquer it. Ernst Vogel sat across from Captain Richard Halloran in a canvas tent that smelled of damp wool and cigarette smoke. The captain was exhausted, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of processing surrenders, displaced persons, and the endless paperwork of occupation. He expected another confession of minor collaboration, another plea for leniency. Instead, Vogel spoke quietly and without emotion. "I am the one they called the ghost hunter. I took your men." Halloran's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. The translator, a German-speaking corporal from Milwaukee, repeated the sentence in English, though he had heard it perfectly the first time. For a moment, the tent was silent, except for the distant rumble of supply trucks on the road outside. Vogel did not look like a killer. His face was weathered and deeply lined, the skin of a man who had spent decades exposed to wind and rain. His hands were large and scarred, the hands of someone who had worked with axes and traps and rough wood. He wore a patched wool coat and boots, held together with wire. There was no malice in his expression, no pride, no defiance, only a kind of weary resignation, as if he had carried a secret for too long and was finally unburdening himself. Halloran leaned forward, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. "You're telling me you killed 17 American soldiers?" Vogel shook his head slowly. "I did not kill them. I captured them. There is a difference." The corporal translated, but Halloran interrupted. "Where are they? Are they alive?" Vogel met his gaze without flinching. "Some are alive, some are not. I did what I could." The captain stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden planks beneath the tent. "You did what you could? You abducted American soldiers and you're telling me you did what you could?" His voice rose, sharp with anger and disbelief. Vogel remained seated, his hands folded in his lap. "I am not a soldier. I am a woodsman. I did not choose this war. The forest is my home. Your men came into my home, and I did what I have always done. I hunted." Halloran ordered 2 guards into the tent and had Vogel placed under armed watch. Then he sent an urgent radio message to division headquarters. "Suspect in custody claims responsibility for Sector 7 disappearances. Requests immediate interrogation by G2. Within hours, an intelligence officer arrived by jeep, accompanied by a stenographer and a medic. The interrogation resumed in a more formal setting, with Vogel's words recorded verbatim. He spoke for 3 hours, pausing only to drink water or clarify a detail through the translator. What emerged was not the confession of a fanatic or a collaborator, but something far stranger, a meticulous account of survival, isolation, and the collision between an old man's way of life and the machinery of modern war. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. We are interested in knowing to which places and at which moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. Ernst Vogel had lived in the Hürtgen forest since childhood. His family had been foresters and hunters for generations, managing timber rights and game populations for the local estates. When the Nazi regime came to power, Vogel refused to join the party or participate in the mobilization efforts. He was too old for conscription, and his skills were deemed more valuable in maintaining the forest infrastructure. But as the war progressed and the front lines moved west, the forest became a battleground. Artillery shattered the ancient trees, tanks churned the trails into mud, soldiers from both sides trampled through underbrush, setting fires, leaving trash, disturbing the wildlife. Vogel retreated deeper into the woods, to a hunting cabin his grandfather had built near a limestone ridge. There, he intended to wait out the war in isolation. But isolation became impossible. American patrols began moving through his territory, loud and careless, breaking branches, shouting to each other, leaving their scent everywhere. Vogel watched them from concealment, studying their patterns, their weaknesses. He did not hate them. He did not know them. But they were intruders, and the forest was his responsibility. When the first soldier wandered away from his unit, Vogel made a decision. He would capture the man, hold him until the armies moved on, and then release him. It was not a political act. It was not revenge. It was simply what a hunter does when something enters his territory uninvited. He approached the soldier from behind, using a technique he had perfected on deer and boar. Move when the wind moves. Step where the moss grows thick. Breathe with the rhythm of the forest. The soldier never heard him. Vogel used a leather sling, a device he had crafted for restraining injured animals, to immobilize the man without harming him. He gagged him with cloth, bound his hands, and led him through the forest to the cabin. The soldier struggled at first, terrified, but Vogel spoke to him in German, his voice calm and steady, as if gentling a spooked horse. "I will not hurt you. You are safe. Be still." The soldier did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. Over the following weeks, Vogel captured 6 more men using the same method. He kept them in a root cellar beneath the cabin, a space originally built for storing vegetables and cured meat. He fed them what he could: rabbits, mushrooms, wild greens, water from a nearby spring. He did not speak to them beyond simple commands. He did not explain himself. In his mind, he was simply doing what had to be done until the war ended and the forest returned to silence. The root cellar was cold and dark, lit only by a single lantern Vogel brought down twice a day. The space was roughly 10 feet by 12, with stone walls and a dirt floor that smelled of earth and old wood. The captured soldiers sat on blankets, their hands bound with rope, their fear gradually giving way to confusion, and then to a strange, numb acceptance. They did not know where they were. They did not know who had taken them. The old man, who descended the stairs each morning and evening, moved with the efficiency of someone performing a routine chore, checking their bindings, distributing food, emptying the waste bucket. He spoke only in German, which none of them understood, and he showed no interest in interrogation or propaganda. He simply kept them alive. Private Daniel Kowalski, captured in October, later told investigators that the first week was the worst. "We thought he was going to execute us. Every time he came down those stairs, I thought, this is it, but he just gave us water and some kind of stew and left. After a while, you stop being scared and start being angry. Then you stop being angry and you just wait." The men developed a silent communication system, using gestures and expressions to share information. They estimated the passage of time by counting the old man's visits. They tried to keep each other's spirits up, whispering reassurances in the dark. But as weeks turned into months, hope began to erode. They heard explosions in the distance, the rumble of artillery, the drone of aircraft. The war was ongoing, but they were trapped in a timeless void beneath the earth. Vogel's routine never varied. He woke before dawn, checked his snares, foraged for food, and tended to the captives. He treated them with the same pragmatic care he had once given to injured animals, keeping them fed, preventing infection, ensuring they did not freeze. He did not see them as enemies. He saw them as problems to be managed until circumstances changed, but managing 7 men required resources, and resources were scarce. The forest had been devastated by combat. Game was harder to find. Foraging was dangerous, with unexploded ordnance littering the ground. Vogel began to understand that his plan, to wait out the war and release the soldiers when peace returned, was unsustainable. He could not feed them indefinitely. He could not keep them hidden if the fighting intensified in his sector. In December, during one of the coldest nights of the winter, Private Howard Jens developed pneumonia. Vogel recognized the symptoms immediately: the wet cough, the fever, the shallow breathing. He brought down extra blankets, brewed a tea from pine bark and herbs, and stayed with Jens through the night, monitoring his condition. But without antibiotics or proper warmth, the infection worsened. Jens died 3 days later, quietly in his sleep. Vogel buried him at the edge of a clearing, marking the grave with a simple cairn of stones. He felt no guilt. He had done what he could, but he understood that the situation had escalated beyond his control. The other captives watched him with new wariness. They had seen that death was possible, even likely. The old man's competence could only protect them so far. By January, Vogel had captured 3 more soldiers, bringing the total to 9. The cellar was overcrowded, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and damp wool. Discipline among the captives began to fray. Arguments broke out over the distribution of food. One man, Corporal Lewis Grant, attempted to overpower Vogel when he descended the stairs. The struggle was brief. Vogel was stronger than he looked, and he had the advantage of surprise. He subdued Grant with a chokehold, then bound him more tightly than the others. After that, Vogel began visiting the cellar less frequently, leaving food and water for longer intervals. He was growing weary. The burden of maintaining the captives, combined with the relentless destruction of the forest, was wearing him down. In February, 2 more men died, one from dysentery, the other from complications related to frostbite. Vogel buried them alongside Jens, expanding the small cemetery in the clearing. He began to question his own logic. What had he accomplished? He had removed 9 soldiers from the war, but the war continued regardless. The forest was still being destroyed. The noise and violence showed no signs of stopping. And now he was responsible for the lives of 7 men who hated him, feared him, and would certainly testify against him if they were ever freed. He considered releasing them, simply opening the cellar door and walking away. But he knew they would report his location. Soldiers would come. He would be arrested or killed. The cabin, his sanctuary, would be lost. So he continued. He captured 2 more men in March, though by then his heart was no longer in it. He moved through the forest like an automaton, performing actions that had lost their meaning. The war was ending. He could sense it in the reduced frequency of patrols, the distant sound of retreating artillery. But he could not stop. The hunt had become a compulsion, a way of asserting control over a world that had become incomprehensible. When the final soldier was taken in early April, Vogel looked at the young man's terrified face and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no purpose, only exhaustion. That night, he sat outside his cabin and stared at the stars, visible for the first time in months through the thinning smoke. He made his decision. In the morning, he would walk to the nearest American checkpoint and surrender. He would tell them everything. Whatever happened after that was out of his hands. Captain Halloran listened to Vogel's account with a mixture of disbelief and cold fury. The translator's voice remained steady, but the words themselves seemed to distort reality. An old man with no military training, no political agenda, no hatred for Americans, simply capturing soldiers because they had entered his forest. It was absurd. It was monstrous. And yet, Vogel's demeanor suggested he believed every word he was saying. He showed no signs of delusion or fabrication. He answered questions directly, provided specific details, and even offered to lead them to the cabin where the surviving captives were being held. Halloran wanted to dismiss it as the ravings of a disturbed mind, but the dates matched. The descriptions of the soldiers matched, and there was something in Vogel's eyes, a deep, animal certainty that made it impossible to ignore. "How many are still alive?" Halloran asked, his voice tight. Vogel thought for a moment. 6, maybe 7. I have not been to the cellar in 3 days. The captain's jaw clenched. "You haven't been there in 3 days. They're locked underground without supervision?" Vogel nodded. "I left enough food and water. They will survive." Halloran stood and paced the length of the tent. Every instinct told him to have this man shot immediately, but procedure demanded verification. If Vogel was telling the truth, there were American soldiers still alive, trapped in a cellar in the middle of a devastated forest. He turned to the intelligence officer. "Assemble a recovery team. Full squad, medic, translator. We leave in 1 hour." The convoy moved slowly through the forest, following logging roads that had been chewed apart by tank treads and mortar fire. Vogel sat in the back of a jeep, flanked by 2 armed guards, his hands bound in front of him. He directed the driver with small gestures, left at the fallen oak, right where the trail splits, straight through the clearing with the blackened stumps. The soldiers were tense, weapons ready, scanning the tree line for ambushes. But the forest was silent, except for the crunch of tires on broken ground and the occasional call of a crow. After 90 minutes, Vogel pointed to a narrow path barely visible through the undergrowth. "There. The cabin is 200 meters ahead." "Dad." They proceeded on foot, moving in tactical formation. The cabin appeared suddenly, a low structure of weathered logs and moss-covered shingles, almost invisible against the surrounding trees. It looked abandoned, the kind of place hunters might use for a single night before moving on. Halloran signaled the squad to secure the perimeter while he and the medic approached the door. Vogel remained with the guards, watching impassively. The captain pushed the door open. It was unlocked, and stepped inside. The interior was sparse, a cot, a wood stove, shelves lined with jars of preserved food, tools hanging from nails. Everything was meticulously organized, almost obsessively clean, and in the corner, partially concealed by a wooden panel, was a trapdoor. Halloran lifted the panel and shone a flashlight into the darkness below. The smell hit him immediately. Sweat, urine, rot. He heard movement, a shuffling sound, and then a voice, hoarse and disbelieving. "Is someone there?" The captain's throat tightened. "This is Captain Halloran, U.S. Army. We're here to get you out." A sob echoed up from the cellar, then another, and then a chorus of voices, overlapping, desperate. "Oh, God! Oh, thank God! We're here! We're alive! Please get us out!" The medic descended the ladder first, followed by 2 soldiers. Within minutes, 6 men were brought up into the daylight, blinking and shaking, their faces pale and gaunt. They were alive, but barely. If this story has surprised you, leave a like to help the channel. The recovered soldiers were evacuated immediately to a field hospital. None of them had suffered physical torture, but malnutrition, exposure, and psychological trauma were evident. They were debriefed over the following days, and their testimonies were consistent. The old man had captured them without violence, held them in the cellar, fed them minimally, and largely ignored them. He had not interrogated them. He had not abused them. He had simply kept them as if they were animals in a pen. The psychological impact of that treatment, being reduced to objects, deprived of agency, trapped in darkness for months, was profound. Several of the men would require long-term psychiatric care. One would never fully recover. Vogel was transferred to a military detention facility pending trial. Halloran filed a report recommending charges of kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and negligent homicide for the 3 men who had died in captivity. But as the investigation deepened, complications emerged. Vogel had not been a member of the German military. He had not acted under orders. He had no affiliation with the Nazi Party or any resistance group. He was, by all legal definitions, a civilian who had committed crimes during wartime, but crimes that did not fit neatly into existing categories. Was he a war criminal, a common criminal, a mentally disturbed individual? The legal officers assigned to the case struggled to find precedent. Meanwhile, the story of the ghost hunter began to spread. Soldiers who had served in Sector 7 felt a strange, uncomfortable vindication. Their fears had not been irrational. There had been something in the forest. But that validation came with a bitter edge. The phantom they had feared, the invisible predator who had haunted their nights, was an old man with no training, no technology, no support. He had bested an entire division, not through superior firepower or tactics, but through intimate knowledge of the terrain and the patience of someone who had spent a lifetime reading the forest's rhythms. It was humiliating. It was incomprehensible. And it raised questions no one wanted to answer. How many other Ernst Vogels existed in occupied Europe? How many invisible enemies had the war created, not through ideology, but through desperation and displacement? The trial of Ernst Vogel began in late June 1945, held in a requisitioned courthouse in a small town near the French border. The proceedings were conducted in English and German, with a panel of 3 military judges presiding. Vogel was assigned a defense attorney, a lieutenant from the Judge Advocate General's Corps, who had studied international law before the war. The prosecution presented testimony from the 6 surviving captives, medical reports detailing their condition upon rescue, and forensic evidence from the cabin and burial site. The case should have been straightforward, an open and shut conviction for multiple felonies. But the defense introduced complications that transformed the trial into something far more ambiguous. Vogel's attorney argued that his client had acted not out of malice, but out of a delusional belief that he was protecting his home. Psychiatric evaluations revealed that Vogel suffered from what would later be termed radical territorialism, an extreme psychological attachment to place, exacerbated by years of isolation and the trauma of seeing his environment destroyed. The defense did not dispute the facts. Vogel had captured the soldiers, held them against their will, and failed to provide adequate care, resulting in deaths. But intent mattered. Vogel genuinely believed he was acting within his rights as a steward of the forest. He had not intended to kill. He had not tortured or abused. He had, in his own mind, been merciful. The prosecution countered that ignorance of law was no defense, and that Vogel's actions, regardless of motive, constituted war crimes under the Geneva Conventions. The soldiers had been non-combatants at the time of capture, unarmed, isolated, posing no threat. Holding them in conditions that led to death was criminal negligence at minimum, murder at worst. The emotional testimony of the survivors was damning. Corporal Daniel Kowalski described the psychological torture of captivity. Every day, you wake up in the dark, and you don't know if this is the day you die. You don't know why you're there. You don't know what he wants. You're not a person anymore. You're just waiting. The judges listened in silence, their expressions unreadable. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Vogel himself was called to testify, and he spoke for nearly 4 hours. He described his life in the forest, the traditions of his family, the collapse of the world he had known. He admitted his actions but did not apologize. "I did what I believed was necessary," he said through the translator. "I did not wish harm. I wished only for the forest to be left in peace." When asked if he understood that his actions had caused suffering, he paused. "Yes, I understand now. But at the time, I saw only intruders. I saw only threats to what I was meant to protect." The prosecutor pressed him. "Did you see them as human beings?" Vogel looked down at his hands. "I saw them as soldiers. Later, I saw them as prisoners. I did not see them as men until it was too late." The verdict was delivered on a grey morning in mid-July. Vogel was found guilty of unlawful imprisonment and negligent homicide. The judges acknowledged the psychiatric factors, but concluded that Vogel's actions, however motivated, had violated fundamental principles of human rights and military conduct. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with eligibility for parole after 10. The sentence was considered lenient by some, excessively harsh by others. The surviving captives had mixed reactions. Some felt justice had been served. Others felt nothing, no satisfaction, no closure, only the lingering weight of trauma. Vogel showed no emotion when the sentence was read. He was escorted from the courtroom and transferred to a military prison in Bavaria, where he would spend the next decade in confinement. But the story did not end with the verdict. In the months following the trial, journalists began investigating the case, drawn by its strangeness and moral complexity. Articles appeared in American and European newspapers, framing Vogel as everything from a war criminal to a tragic figure caught between two worlds. Some writers emphasized the horror experienced by the captives, others focused on Vogel's isolation and the psychological impact of total war on civilian populations. The Hürtgen forest itself became a symbol, a place where the boundaries between victim and perpetrator, sanity and madness, had dissolved into fog and shadow. The 6 surviving soldiers returned to the United States and attempted to rebuild their lives. For most, the process was slow and painful. Daniel Kowalski struggled with nightmares and panic attacks for years. He eventually became a counselor for veterans, using his experience to help others process trauma. Corporal Lewis Grant, who had attempted to overpower Vogel, never spoke publicly about his captivity. He died in 1968, reportedly from suicide. The others scattered across the country, carrying their invisible wounds into marriages, careers, and quiet desperation. They rarely spoke of the ghost hunter, but the memory lingered, a dark room in the mind that could never be fully illuminated. Ernst Vogel served his sentence without incident. Prison records describe him as a model inmate, quiet, obedient, spending his time reading and working in the prison's carpentry shop. He was released on parole in 1955, a free man in a Germany that had been rebuilt and transformed beyond recognition. He returned to the Hürtgen forest, or what remained of it. The land had been cleared and replanted, the old trails erased by new roads. The cabin was gone, demolished or reclaimed by nature. Vogel found work as a caretaker at a forestry station, living alone in a small cottage on the edge of the woods. He never married. He never sought attention. He lived quietly until his death in 1971, at the age of 89. His obituary, published in a local newspaper, made no mention of the war or the trial. It described him simply as a forester who loved the land. The legacy of Ernst Vogel and the ghost hunter case extends far beyond the courtroom or the individual lives it touched. In the decades following the war, military historians and psychologists returned to the incident repeatedly, using it as a case study in the unpredictable dynamics of occupation, the psychological toll of guerrilla-style threats, and the moral gray zones that emerge when traditional definitions of combatant and non-combatant collapse. Vogel's actions defied easy categorization. He was not a partisan. He had no political affiliation. He was not a soldier. He had received no training and followed no chain of command. He was simply a man who, when his world was invaded, responded with the only tools he understood: patience, knowledge of terrain, and the hunter's instinct. The American military incorporated lessons from the case into training protocols for occupation forces. Manuals on counterinsurgency and civilian interaction began to emphasize the importance of understanding local populations, recognizing that threats could emerge from unexpected sources, not just organized resistance, but individuals acting alone, motivated by personal grievances or psychological distress. The ghost hunter became a cautionary tale. Underestimate the environment, ignore the human element, and even a single elderly woodsman can paralyze a division. It was a humbling lesson, one that would be revisited in later conflicts in Asia, the Middle East, and beyond. For the survivors and their families, the case raised questions that had no satisfying answers. Why had Vogel been treated with relative leniency? Why had the focus of the trial shifted, at times, to his psychological state rather than the suffering of his victims? Some felt that the system had failed them, that justice had been diluted by sympathy for a man who, regardless of his mental state, had stolen months or years from their loved ones' lives. Others understood the complexity, but struggled to reconcile it emotionally. Forgiveness was not possible, but neither was pure hatred. Vogel existed in their minds as a figure both monstrous and pitiable, a reminder that evil often wears the face of ordinariness. The forest itself, the Hurtgen, became a place of pilgrimage and remembrance. In the 1950s and 1960s, veterans returned to the area, walking the trails where they had fought, searching for the sites of battles and losses. Some sought the clearing where Vogel had buried the 3 men who died in his captivity. The graves were unmarked and eventually lost to time, swallowed by new growth. But the memory persisted. Memorials were erected throughout the region, honoring the thousands who had fought and died in the brutal forest campaign. Vogel's name was not included, but his presence haunted the landscape like a ghost that refused to be exorcised. In the 1980s, a German filmmaker produced a documentary about the case, interviewing surviving soldiers, legal experts, and psychologists. The film sparked renewed debate about accountability, trauma, and the nature of wartime justice. Some viewers saw Vogel as a victim of circumstance, a man broken by forces beyond his control. Others saw him as a criminal who had exploited vulnerability and caused irreparable harm. The film offered no conclusions, only questions. It ended with footage of the forest, silent, green, indifferent, and a voiceover quoting one of the survivors. The war ended, but the shadows never left. They're still out there in the trees, waiting. The psychological impact of the ghost hunter phenomenon has been studied extensively. Researchers have noted that the fear experienced by soldiers in Sector 7 was qualitatively different from the fear of combat. In battle, fear is immediate and adrenaline-fueled, but it is also comprehensible. You see the enemy, you respond. The ghost hunter induced a low-grade, persistent dread that eroded morale and trust. Soldiers could not see the threat, could not predict it, could not fight it. That kind of uncertainty, sustained over months, produces a unique form of trauma, one that manifests not as flashbacks to specific incidents, but as a generalized anxiety, a sense that danger is always present but never visible. Ernst Vogel's story is not one of heroism or villainy, but of something more unsettling, the collision between an individual's internal logic and the chaos of history. He believed he was acting rationally, even morally. He saw himself as a protector, not a predator, and yet his actions caused profound suffering. That contradiction lies at the heart of the case's enduring fascination. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about perspective, power, and the fragility of the boundaries we construct between right and wrong. Vogel was not insane. He was coherent, methodical, even compassionate within his own framework. But his framework was incompatible with the reality of the soldiers he captured, and that incompatibility produced tragedy. The final chapter of the ghost hunter's story belongs not to Vogel or his captives, but to the forest itself. The Hurtgen has recovered, at least superficially. Trees have grown back, wildlife has returned. Hikers and tourists walk trails that once ran with blood and mud, but beneath the surface, the land remembers. Unexploded ordnance still lies buried in the soil. Foundations of bunkers and foxholes mark the earth like scars, and somewhere, in the older stands of timber where the light barely penetrates, there is a silence that feels deliberate, a space where the past refuses to fully recede. The war ended, but the forest, like memory, preserves what cannot be spoken. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following the story of Ernst Vogel. See you in the next video.